Hey everybody, welcome to Office Hours. I'm Jeremy Champa. This is Higher Learning Test Prep. And today we're just going to tackle a really quick question about the SAT essay. And we're just going to outline a few brief concepts that you can use on this essay. By no means are we going to go into detail about everything that comes up on the essay. There's a lot of stuff to talk about, but I just want to give a few quick tips for a student who was wondering, and he knows who he is. So I'm going to screen share, and we're going to look at the topic. We're going to look at the way the SAT presents this assignment, and then I'm just going to tell you a few things that typically help students the most. So let's screen share here, going through the vortex over to the other side. Here we have the SAT's first example prompt. I'm not going to go through everything here, but what I just want to talk about is what your task is and just a few things that can help. So your task is to read an essay and then to think about evidence, reasoning, and style. Right? At the bottom of this essay, which I'll let you read, and you can also read some sample scores of how somebody did really well. It's really useful to look at how someone got a perfect score and the areas for which they got perfect score, sort of looking at why the score was so high. So I do want to just bring up, let's see here. I want to look at the language right under here. It says, write an essay in which you explain how Bogart builds an argument. So that's important. How does he build an argument to persuade his audience? Analyze one or more features. So that's evidence, reasoning, and style that strengthen the logic and persuasiveness of his argument. And this is really important too. It says, focus on the most relevant features of the passage. So what you're not doing is just looking for random, really unique stuff to talk about. Focus on the most relevant features. It also says, don't talk about whether or not you agree with the author, just how he builds an argument to persuade the audience. So that phrase comes up again, building an argument to persuade his audience. All right, I'm going to stop screen sharing here and just say a couple things that people misinterpret here. So a lot of folks are familiar with this idea of talking about pathos, ethos. Those kind of technical concepts are unnecessary here. Sure, you can bring them up. I think in one of the two top scoring essays that are on this website, one of those words comes up once. I forget if it's pathos, ethos, or logos, but one of those words comes up once. The point is that you don't have to, just like on the rest of the SAT, you don't have to have some specific highfalutin knowledge. You don't need calculus to get a perfect score in the SAT. You don't need to have read Shakespeare. You don't need to know what ethos, pathos, and logos are. You don't need those things. What you do need to do is thoroughly analyze what the author has done a good job of doing, right? So something that I use constantly is the annoying younger sibling concept. So what this is, if you're going to the grocery store and you're with your younger sibling, they may ask your parent, like, where are we going? The parent says, to the grocery store, which is never enough for the annoying younger sibling. The annoying younger sibling will ask, why? And your parent might say, well, because we need food. And then the sibling says, why? The parent says, well, because we're going to get hungry later. Well, why? So now we start talking about the reasons we're going to get hungry later, right? So, well, because we're humans and we need to eat. Why? Well, because that's the way metabolism works. Why? Like, I don't know. We're getting really deep here. We're just going to the grocery store and now we're talking about metabolism. My point is that if you use the prompt why, over and over again, you can get deeper into an analysis, right? So if you think the author uses a story and a personal narrative, and that's really good, well, why is that good? Why does that personal narrative work? So you might say, well, the personal narrative is great because it lets us know that the author has, firsthand experience with what they're talking about. Well, great. Why does that matter? Well, by showing us that he or she has firsthand experience, we begin to trust that the narrator's opinion is valid and based on something tangible. Well, why does that matter? Well, because the rest of the essay perhaps is lacking in, maybe the rest of the essay is very data driven. So the use of this personal narrative sets up and personalizes the story. And you might say, well, why does that matter, right? So you can see that we're getting deeper and deeper into the reason that something is persuasive and effective as someone is building an argument. Right? So the idea is why? You don't have to ask yourself why 100 times like an annoying younger sibling, but see if you can use that why to add one extra sentence of analysis. Usually what people do is they give an example, they explain why the example is effective in one sentence after they've given the example, and they think they're done. See if you can just ask yourself why, or how, or who cares. Some question that can allow you to go a little bit deeper into your analysis, right? So that annoying younger sibling concept can help you get a better analysis score. So there's 3 things you're graded on. That's analysis. The other 2 are reading and writing. The most important thing I can say about the reading score, which I used to kind of gloss over, most important thing I can say is don't say anything that's factually inaccurate. Be really careful that every claim you make is actually what's happening in the passage. I've seen students just say little things like, the author uses this example to manipulate the audience or something like that. That's probably not true in any example. They're not trying to manipulate the audience. That doesn't really resonate with graders because that's a judgment that is not necessarily true. It's not objectively true. So be careful when you're using language to describe what happens in the passage. Make sure that what you're saying is absolutely accurate. You don't have to talk about everything in the passage. So anything that you do talk about, just make sure you really know what's happening there. In terms of the writing score, the most important things you can do, don't try too hard with key language. I'll give you just a few $5 words you can throw out there. Coalition building. I really like that phrase. A coalition is a loose group of associated people that may not agree on everything, but come together for a cause. You can use that phrase to talk about the author bringing different groups together. If you use stats, you might be appealing to a certain kind of reader. If you use emotional language, another kind of reader. If you refer to some sort of national pride, that's a different kind of reader. If you can bring these different groups together, you've built a coalition of disparate groups. And doing so can be a great benefit when you're trying to persuade mass audiences. So coalition building, great phrase to use. Juxtaposition. You're going to be sick of this word by the time you're done with college. It's going to sound cheesy and lame by then. But at this point, it's a good word because what it talks about is sort of the relationship of 2 ideas to each other, 2 ideas that may not always go together. So if the author juxtaposes the opinions of his opponents with stats that support his own opinion, right? What that person is doing is putting 2 things next to each other that kind of demonstrate something that's true or a relationship that they want to draw attention to. So juxtaposition, that's a good word to use on this test. As long as you're using it correctly, and that's actually more important, is that make sure you don't like stretch out into language that you're not so, wishy-washy on. And make sure you vary your sentence structure. That's a different and important point about the writing. Make sure you sort of don't write the same kind of sentence over and over and over again, unless you're doing so for effect, which really doesn't make sense in this kind of writing. Certainly that can be done in storytelling or in poetry or something like that. But in this case, varying sentence structure, varying sentence length, these things are important because it makes the reading a little bit more enjoyable. So vary your sentence structure. Don't overdo it with fancy language, but use some big words if you can. And know that you're not going to get points off if you misspell a word or you misplace a comma or something like that. That's not what they're grading you on. So you don't have to worry about that stuff. Just one other thing I want to talk about, which is how to effectively read the piece to begin with. Maybe I should talk about others. When you're reading the piece, you want to actively read. So circle stuff that appeals to you. If you think something's persuasive, circle it right away. Find the things that you think are effective. pause after every paragraph and kind of remind yourself what just happened in that paragraph and what part of that paragraph was the most effective. See if you can draw arrows from like the beginning of paragraph 2 and the end of paragraph 3 and be like, oh, those two things relate, or this author mentioned this thing in the introduction and brings it back around in the conclusion. So you should really be like kind of charting out the structure of this person's argument. How does the ideas in the first paragraph relate to the ideas in the third paragraph, and so on. I also think it's important to discuss in your essay the way different pieces work together, right? So if you talk about the way a personal narrative at the beginning works with data that follows it or something like that, those are good things to think about, because again, we were asked to consider how they build an argument, right? So how do these features, not just what are these features, but how these features work together, right? If you're talking about how to build a home, you don't just say he used, wood and concrete and metal. Great. Well, how did the author or the builder build, their home or their argument? So talk about the way things fit together. That's important when you're thinking about how to build an argument. And last thing I want to say, I may have already said it was the last thing, but I'm kind of just riffing here. Last thing I want to mention is don't feel like you have to break up your organization into like introduction, evidence paragraph, reasoning paragraph, style paragraph, conclusion. What I want to see, well, I won't see it until, unless you send me your question and answer report, and then I'll read it and let you know. But what the graders want to see is a fairly intuitive organization based on like important components. So that doesn't mean like talk about evidence, talk about reasoning, talk about style. It means like talk about a certain style of a certain kind of example, let's say, right? So like if you're talking about how the author uses statistics, well, write a paragraph about that. If you want to talk about the way the author uses, like we said earlier, a personal anecdote, talk about that. Maybe put your most important example first, but organize things according to like an intuitive sense of the type of evidence or style or reasoning. Don't feel like you have to group them according to evidence, style, and reasoning per se. You could talk about, mostly evidence and a little bit of style. There's no such thing as an essay without style. If it's lacking in emotional language, that's a style, right? If it's heavily laden with comedic language, that's a style, right? So there's always something to talk about stylistically. Evidence and reasoning go together because evidence is the stuff that's just, facts, things that don't require explanation, but almost everything requires some explanation. That explanation is the reasoning, right? So anything that builds off of facts towards a greater point is reasoning. Right? So, but don't feel like you have to separate these things into those categories either. Just talk about the most useful components. Don't worry about technically defining them as evidence, reasoning, or style, and see if you can use this idea of the annoying younger sibling to go deeper into your analysis in each piece. Okay, I lied. One more thing, transitions. Transitions, just make sure that as you're linking up ideas, end one paragraph with something that's going to flow nicely into the next paragraph. And, just think about how you would have a conversation. It doesn't have to be the most beautiful transition. Just acknowledge where you are and where you're going, right? Like, if you're talking about a personal anecdote and then you're going to go into statistics, you might say at the end of the paragraph about the personal anecdote, you might say something like, this use of this story lends a personal sort of component to an essay which is otherwise full of, quantifiable statistics, right? Next paragraph talks about data. Right, just a little hint as to what's coming next. They love that, and that will help you with your writing score. Okay, so that's a lot of stuff. Hopefully some of that helps. And until next time, take care.